You're thinking, what's the new equation? It's about building trust and delivering sustained outcomes that make change for today and tomorrow.
Welcome to our Women in Leadership podcast and podcast series sponsored by PwC. I'm Haley Wooden, Executive Editor of Business in Vancouver, and we're broadcasting today from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It's my pleasure to host this 3-episode series. It features inspiring female leaders from different backgrounds and sectors on topics that are important to all of us: leadership and mentorship, ESG, and EDI. And across the series, our guests will be in conversation with me and experts from PwC. Episodes run March 8th to 10th around, of course, International Women's Day on March 8th. And today's episode takes a look at leadership and ESG. Today's episode takes a look at leadership and ESG. I'm joined by Shelley Gilberg, a partner at PwC Canada and the firm's Canada leader in ESG markets and consulting. Shelley, great to have you join us. Thanks for coming on board.
Thanks so much, Haley.
And we're pleased to have Jennifer Coulson joining us as well. Jennifer is Senior Managing Director of ESG at BCI, which provides investment management services to British Columbia's public sector and has $199.6 billion of managed assets. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Haley.
Why don't we start with you? You've been at BCI for, I think, a little over a decade now. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you do and the work that BCI does?
Sure. Well, BCI is a dedicated asset manager, largely for the public sector pension plans in the province. So as you said, pretty close to $200 billion in assets under management. So everything from equities to fixed income to private equity to infrastructure. And of course, we have a real estate subsidiary as well, QuadReal, headquartered in Vancouver. And so I lead a team of ESG professionals here. There are 8 of us, and we work primarily with the public side of the business. So that includes equities and fixed income. But I also chair a corporate ESG working group, which has representatives across all of our asset classes, so that we, really have a consistent approach to ESG integration, as well as all of our ESG work. So that's it in a nutshell.
And I'm looking forward to hearing your insights on the ESG space and how that's evolved. But first, really quickly, Jennifer, why ESG as opposed to another area or another kind of investing?
Yeah, I think I was in the right place at the right time, to be honest. I was actually heading for a career more in the nonprofit sector, in the 1990s. Decided to go back to school, do a graduate degree in environmental studies. And when I finished that degree, saw a job posting for what we would call sustainable investing or responsible investing now. But it was, with one of the pioneers in Canada in the retail industry. And I did not know that this kind of job existed. So when I read the job description, I just thought, this is perfect for me, because I can use my background in social sciences, but apply it in a very practical, business-oriented sense. So I really liked that combination of the social sciences combined with, the practicality of business. So it just felt like a really great fit for me. And I mean, I'm just so grateful that, I actually got that job that I applied to, over 20 years ago. And here I am, 20 years later, still just so passionate about this work.
Shelley, I'd love to hear from you on this point as well. I mean, you're country leader for PwC Canada when it comes to ESG markets and consulting. For you, why ESG?
I came to it later in life than Jennifer, for one thing, and through a little bit of a different path. Working on the West Coast, so I live in British Columbia as well. I had the opportunity to work with, we've had a sustainability and climate change team in PwC for 20 years. And initially, a lot of the work that we were doing, I would say, would be with directors of sustainability or people responsible for reporting. And what was really interesting to me was there wasn't a lot of linkage to the rest of the organization. I wouldn't say in the client conversations we were having, if I was to go chat with the CFO instead, he would say, yeah, that person over there does that. That doesn't really have anything to do with me. Or the chief operating officer, yeah, we put out a report. Have you ever seen it? I'm like, yeah, but what do you have to do with that? And so for me, it was probably two things, because a little bit like Jennifer. So I asked for this role and I wanted to do it, but for two reasons. One is listening to people describe ESG as a cost or a compliance exercise versus really sort of understanding it as an integral set of risks and opportunities for organizations, I thought was a gap. And the second basket of clients I would say we had were folks that were trailblazing and purpose-led, but did not have a plan underneath that for how they were going to tie all this together. And the intellectual challenge of helping clients take it from being something that they think is good to do or nice to do and saying it actually has to be part of everything in order for it to both sort of protect and preserve value and keep an eye on risk, but also actually get at the opportunities that are coming was to me really exciting. That challenge of putting those things together was something that appealed to me. And you described me as an expert at the beginning, and I would say Jennifer's an expert. I'm sort of the applied expertise side of ESG, of helping clients knit all of that together so that their employees believe what they're doing makes sense. Their investors agree that the things that they're focused on and measuring make sense. Their customers and their clients agree that what they're doing and how they're going about it and their products and services make sense. So it's, for me, just fantastic integration of all of the things that kind of make up my background.
And Shelley, you mentioned that ESG at one point in time was maybe thought of its own department in its own silo, and it wasn't spread out or even thought of across an organization. Is that changing now?
I think it's changing really rapidly. And I would say the last 18 to 24 months, definitely. Jennifer may laugh when I say this, but the number of people that 2 years ago would say, ESG is non-financial measures. There is an enormous shift in the boardroom, both board and executive teams, to understand that it is actually financial, both in terms of risk and opportunity. And that brings a whole different cast of characters to the conversation about how do you tap into the opportunity and how do you understand the risks that you're facing, whether those are risks to retaining customers, whether those are risks in terms of increased cost of capital, attracting talent. The conversations changed dramatically, Haley, in a very short period of time.
Yeah, and Haley, if I can, yeah, just to compare that as well, to the investor side, because that integration is happening on the corporate side, and the same thing is happening on the investor side, where maybe you had one or two people that focused on ESG. You could kind of tick a few boxes in terms of your ESG integration approach, to the point now where the teams are growing. They are becoming larger, but they're also changing where they're sitting in the organization. So very similar to what Shelley was saying. I mean, these are not distinct teams that are hiding in the basement anymore. They're really central and working directly with the investment teams, and potentially managing money themselves, with very specific mandates. So that similar shift has also happened within the finance world.
Yeah, it's very interesting to sort of think of ESG as everything but the finances at one point in time, and now looking at it much more, I guess, holistically, you might say. Jennifer, what are some of the conversations you and your team are having today within BCI about maybe how you frame ESG or how you look at it a bit differently?
Yeah, sure. And if I compare it to where we were, let's call it 10 years ago, where again, companies thought of it very much through a corporate social responsibility type of lens. What kind of philanthropy are we doing? What kind of employee programs do we have? And it was all about, putting your best foot forward, right? So it was almost a promotional exercise in some ways, certainly a marketing initiative. Whereas now, like the conversations that we have both internally, but also with companies in our portfolio, it's much more centered on, how are you using ESG to really drive value in your organization, right? So it's central to the business strategy, and you really want to be focused on those things that are connected to how you're going to accomplish your kind of conventional business goals, because it has become so central to success for so many companies. So it really has shifted quite a bit from this very broad set of issues and topics to what is really material to your business and how does that help you drive value.
Yeah, Shelley, if I can put it this way, it almost sounds like ESG is becoming, to use Jennifer's words, more value-based, but maybe more sincere and impactful. It's not just something that you say because everybody's talking about it. It sounds like it's much more integrated, but much more tied, as Jennifer was saying, to the values of a company and an overall business model even. What do you think's behind some of those changes from your seat at PwC, where I'm sure you're engaging with leaders across a number of sectors on this?
We are indeed, and I'll say something negative first, I'll warn you, and then I'll follow up with something positive. Is I think it's becoming more integrated, but I wouldn't downplay. There's a lot of people that are still saying things to get credit and jumping on a bandwagon. I think there's some leaders who are really integrating this well, but a portion of the time that I spend is we have people that have made announcements or set targets and but didn't actually have an action plan for how they were going to get there. So I think what's driving the sincerity for those that are out ahead is they're actually seeing the returns in terms of the value they're creating. They are growing, they're getting new customers or clients, they're able to grow their business, they're able to introduce new products and services that people want to pay a premium for because they're responsible. Like they're actually seeing it come full circle, that they're doing good, but they're doing well as a result of doing good. I still think there's a tranche, Haley, to be honest, of people that are either a little bit skeptical or they think it's about what they say, because that's sort of what the market can reward right now, because there isn't sort of the level of consistency of reporting standardization. So the negative is we still see people chasing bumps in stock price with announcements. That happens in the market. But I think if I say, where do you put your attention and keep your eye on, is the people that are building trust at every step. They're saying, I don't know how to set this target yet, but I'm going to work on it for the next year. And here's what I'm doing. That sort of thinking about it as how do you bridge a trust gap when you look at what the trust levels are in institutions, in governments, and in business right now. That has to be sort of point number one. And that's what I hear with the organizations that we work with, that I think are truly being sincere and trying to figure out, how do I have healthy enterprise value and healthy values together that keep my shareholders, my stakeholders, my customers, my employees lined up? I think they're doing it well, and they would be the ones that I would sort of say that's the pattern to emulate.
You're thinking, what's the new equation? It's about building trust and delivering sustained outcomes that make change for today and tomorrow.
Great point. And Jennifer, maybe in the term of patterns to emulate, looking at BCI as a leader on this front, what are some best practices you can share for how you look at the environmental, the social, and the governance?
And we do span, all of the different buckets. And I would say really what is on investors' minds right now in terms of those buckets. For E, it's absolutely climate change. Investors have to be seen as playing a role in combating climate change. If we're going to meet, the aspirational target that we've all set for ourselves for 2050. So climate change in particular, there's got to be a strategy there, right? And you have to be seen to be contributing and funding that the transition to net zero. On social, I think, human capital is on everyone's mind, especially in the context of, hopefully recovering from this pandemic. Human capital has really touched everybody. So I think we can all relate. And I think companies are looking at human capital differently after going through COVID, right? It really is more about capital and how you invest in your people. It's not just about labor anymore. And then on the G side, I would certainly highlight diversity and inclusion. Investors have been quite vocal on this front, and it goes to the heart of how decisions are made, right? And if you have a diverse group of people around the table with different perspectives, you are just going to have better decisions, right? So as an investor, we look at the academic evidence that shows that and want to see that diversity reflected in the companies that we invest in. So I would say those would be the topics that would be probably top of mind for the investment community right now.
And I appreciate you mentioning how COVID has maybe impacted some of the conversations happening, particularly around the SPs. Shelley, how have you seen COVID affect your work and the conversations you are taking part in around ESG?
COVID has been a dramatic accelerator, I think, on a whole bunch of fronts, Haley. And I'm watching Jennifer nod. I think Jennifer said it really well. Used to have sort of the sustainability conversation happening in, I won't say a basement office, but a relatively small, self-contained team. And that pervading sort of much more broadly through the organization has changed. But the other thing I think that COVID's done is it has really, I call it this concept of sort of aligning value and values. COVID put a bright light on lots of things, societally and for individuals, that I think one of the things that you're seeing through COVID is the idea that values and value have to actually come together has changed the conversation around ESG. If I think about the kind of work we're doing, we may have been helping with, what do you set for KPIs? What do you measure? How do you sort of report out on that? Well, throughout COVID, that's changed to, how do you set strategy? What do you need to do in terms of your supply chain? And helping our clients look at their stakeholders actually as part of the solution. You don't have to figure it out by yourself. How do you have a conversation with your customers to understand what matters to them? What do your investors and your lenders care about? What does the regulator care about if they're part? The communities you operate in, your employees, your suppliers. It's, I think, made it a much more comprehensive conversation, which is a bit daunting for some clients, to be honest. Like, it's a big endeavor to figure out, how do you weave this through your organization? But it's also made it much more real. And in some regards, it's de-risked it. If you ask your customers what they care about and what matters to them and what they're prepared to pay for, and that's part of the plan, and your investors are confident that your customers like the plan and your employees have been part of engaging in what are you going to do, that takes the mystery out. It's not a big bet anymore. You've actually sort of taken those groups and woven them together. I think for me, that's been, if COVID was a negative thing on a lot of fronts, that's been a really positive part of COVID, is that this idea around values has really sort of come to the center.
Yeah, Jennifer, I was watching you nod along, I think, with almost every word that Shelley just said there. Are you seeing the same thing, the importance and value placed on really community and stakeholder engagement?
Absolutely, and I would agree that COVID has accelerated the ESG space. I mean, demand is very high, and you just look at something like the sustainable bond market. We surpassed $1 trillion last year in sustainable bond issuances, and it's set to hit $1.5 trillion in 2022. So it doesn't really show any sign of things slowing down. And I think there's a number of dynamics at play, but if you think about how many times we heard about resilience, right, in the pandemic. This is what companies had to really struggle with is resilience, and within a system, right? Recognizing that, supply chains are being disrupted, their labor force was disrupted, all of these disruptions going on. And I think there's a lot of parallels there to what we try to do in ESG. I mean, that's the way I think about ESG anyway. It's really about making sure your business is resilient, in the future and going forward. So I just feel like there's a lot of dots that are being connected that really point us in a positive direction. And I think, as Shelley said very well, all stakeholders can be happy with that, right? Because we are an investor at the end of the day, and we need those returns as a shareholder. But the way to do that is to make sure that all of your stakeholders are pleased.
I'll stick with you for a moment, Jennifer. In your view, what does true leadership around ESG look like? It was a bit of a theme earlier, talking about people maybe being reactive or responsive or feeling like they're going through the motions and they're saying the things they should say. But for the companies, the investors, the organizations that are truly leading, what does that involve?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question, and I think it's being redefined, almost daily as the bar continues to raise. But I would underscore, that genuine commitment that we talked about earlier. I do think there is still a lot of cynicism, especially directed at the financial industry in many ways. And so there is going to be a cynicism until investors can show those proof points that they are actually contributing to solutions, right? And I think about some of our leadership work within the industry. As chair of the investor group of the 30% Club of Canada, which is really promoting, diversity on boards and in senior management. And we have pretty much eliminated all male boards in Canada, or I should say on the TSX Composite, certainly not amongst the smaller companies. But 10 years ago, there was 115 all male boards on the composite. So to me, that's a real proof point that, we've put out a genuine commitment. We're transparent about how we go about achieving that commitment. And then we have the proof point to actually point to, not that we are totally doing it ourselves. There's a lot of people involved in that conversation, but we were a part of it, right? And we helped push it forward. So I think it is this connection between what you say and what you do, but then also having those proof points that really show people the tangible outcomes of what you do.
And Shelley, I'll come to you on this as well. I mean, in your view, what does leadership on this look like?
I might be repeating myself because I think I said this earlier, but I think leadership looks like literally creating trust at every step of this. It's engaging your stakeholders. It is looking at risks and opportunities in the same way that you would think about other risks and opportunities. ESG risks should be part of enterprise risk management. ESG opportunities should be part of corporate strategy. It's looking at the priorities that your stakeholders have laid out and being ruthless about applying a business lens to it. Why are we doing it? What are we doing? When are we going to get the benefits? How are we going to be able to measure? Like the same muscles that we would use for any other kind of investment or initiative. I think that's leadership and being honest about the things you don't know. Back to Jennifer's last point, if I think about an example recently, I was sitting down with a large Canadian company that is in a very difficult to abate industry. And most of their competitors have, come out and said, we're going to figure out how to do this by 2030. And they didn't, because for them, they're the largest employer in most of the communities they work in. And they said, Shelley, we don't know what it costs. We actually haven't seen the technology at scale that would let us say we could do it by 2030. And so working through that conversation with them, the reason I highlight them is I think they're an example of how do you be a leader in that space. Is there's not an obvious path for them of how do you not use coal. Right? It's not at scale. The technology and the infrastructure aren't there. But what they're saying is we are still going to focus on the S in terms of the communities we serve and our employees. We're not saying we don't want to get there. We're saying we actually don't understand the path to get there, which gives them a different level of trust with their investors, their employees, and their communities. That I think it's sort of a good object lesson in terms of if you think about Jennifer's point of what do you say, what are you doing, how do you back that up with investor grade reporting about what you're doing, and then the proof points of it. That's not a one-step journey. Right? And I think that's the part that people need to embrace in terms of leadership is you're better off to develop trust at every step than to try and figure out how to drive the car in reverse through an obstacle course and sort of back up on what you've said. And I think the leaders that we're seeing have done a really good job of building that trust at every step and doing that with their stakeholders and being transparent, and then supporting that with the kind of reporting and disclosure that gives people confidence.
Considering that journey in the couple minutes we have left, Jennifer, I'd like to hear what you're going to be focusing on and looking for and monitoring in the months or perhaps years ahead. It's been such a tumultuous time from a COVID perspective, but there have also been important social and cultural movements that have stemmed from crises, and we're also dealing with a climate crisis, which sort of gets us the E, the S, and the G. What are you going to be watching for?
Yeah, another great question. And in terms of where things are heading, I mean, we are in a place now where we have focused quite a bit on reporting and disclosure, and that will continue. But I feel like we're at a pretty good place where we can say, okay, we have data to work with here, right? There's still gaps, absolutely, and we still need to close those gaps. But we do have enough data to work with. And so I'm seeing a lot more kind of innovation, in that how we use the data. So whether that's, building data science teams, using more artificial intelligence type techniques to really leverage the data, because there is quite a bit of data out there right now, as our quant team will attest to. The data is getting to a point where it's good enough you can start getting very innovative with how you ingest that data and how you really leverage it to make better investment decisions. So I would say that's one area that we should definitely watch pretty closely. And I think we all probably are feeling quite positive at this point in terms of the trajectory. And I would just want to make sure that we some of the momentum that we have gained. I mean, we are facing a lot of challenges, just more broadly, whether that's conflict situations, whether that's inflation, whether it's shortage of labor. There's a lot of business challenges ahead, and I think we'll get there with this integrated approach. So just being mindful that we don't take a step backwards and kind of forget how ESG really plays into those very core business problems that we're going to be dealing with.
And Jennifer, to quickly follow up on that great final message and insight, just curious about, you mentioned innovation. What do we know about, or what are you seeing around the need for investment to make that innovation possible?
Yeah, well, I think it's no secret that there is a huge gap. When we look at the commitments that most governments around the world have made on climate change in particular, and how we all want to get to net zero by 2050. But there's been a lot of analysis on that gap that we have in terms of investment. So I think one of the things that we really try to emphasize, with companies is we really need to invest early, right? I mean, like it's getting too late almost, right? I mean, we need to be investing in the research and development so that these technologies can really advance at a faster pace. And some of that will be government, absolutely, but really the private sector is going to have to step up quite a bit here, and try to fill that gap, and make sure that we don't end up feeling, the worst damages, from climate change, because we haven't mitigated, some of the risks around climate change, because we haven't invested enough in the research and development that needs to take place. So it's not an easy solution, and I don't think it's up to any one stakeholder. It's definitely going to, take a community and a village, as they say. But really, we need to see much higher investment in some of the technologies that we are going to need going forward.
It's a challenge, but it also sounds like a great opportunity, especially for Canada and Canadian companies to position themselves globally on this front. Jennifer, Shelley, thank you all so much for taking the time to join the show. It was great to have your insight.
Thank you, Haley. Thanks, Shelley.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Haley.
Our guests today were Jennifer Coulson, Senior Managing Director of ESG at BCI, and Shelley Gilberg, Partner with PwC Canada. She's the firm's Canada leader in ESG markets and consulting. You've been listening to or watching our Women in Leadership podcast and podcast series sponsored by PwC. Other episodes are available at biv.com/audio or biv.com/video. I'm Haley Wooden, Executive Editor of Business in Vancouver. Thanks so much for joining us. You can find other episodes of this series at biv.com, and I encourage you to check those out.